All right, up next we've got Jim and Dan from Tanium. They are going to be a little bit of talking about what's going on in the world today. And without further ado, here they are. I think you guys are all set up. You're ready to roll. They said they're probably not going to take the whole time, and they're willing to take questions after. So enjoy.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So hopefully everybody can hear me all right. Let me just... awesome. My name is Jim Wojno. I'm a technical account manager with Tanium.
And my name is Dan Kita. I'm also a technical account manager with Tanium out of the Cleveland area.
So we want to make sure that you understand this is not a sales pitch. We're not here to talk about Tanium's products. We just basically want to tell you who we are and a little bit about our background, just to sort of give you a level set of why we care about this, what we see in our interactions, and some ideas that we have to hopefully improve the way that we address some fundamental issues in Infosec. So, what we see really as defenders, we consider ourselves blue team members. There's a propensity in the industry to kind of focus on the shiny object. And we're going to talk about that in detail. And we're going to talk to you about how a return to a back-to-basics, security hygiene-focused approach can actually pay a higher dividend to our efforts as defenders, and then also to the businesses that we support. And we're going to go into some details on some concrete steps and examples of things that you as defenders can use in that role. So if we sort of level set what defenders are facing today, none of this should be a surprise to anybody in this room. In preparing for this particular talk, if you look at that slide or the screenshot on the left-hand side there, it might be a little bit hard to read. Do you have Zoom it on here? Awesome. Well, I apologize. What's the hotkey for? Awesome.
Oh, it's not really working.
Okay, well, our apologies for that. So, and I don't know what I did there, so I'm sorry. It's not my laptop, so can you get rid of that?
I just kind of get it there. Yeah, I don't know.
All right, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. So I'll tell you what's up here, so it's a little bit hard to see. But on the left-hand side there, you see that in preparing for this, I went out to TechNet, and I looked at just the security updates for this year. So starting January 1st of this year, and the date up there is October 12th. That was the date that I put this slide together. There were roughly just under 600 security updates for Microsoft. That's one platform, one vendor that you guys are working with in your organizations. If you look on the right-hand side, this one's a little bit more interesting from my perspective. These are the CVEs that were released just for the Windows platform in that same time period, and these are just the CVEs that have a CVSS score of 8 or above. So we're talking about the critical releases, and there were 118 of them as of, again, October the 12th. That was a couple of weeks ago, so my guess is that number is actually a little bit higher. If you look at the type of attacks that are leveraging those vulnerabilities and those exploits, the numbers are really, really high. And again, none of this is really a surprise to anybody in this room. I'm really just kind of trying to lay a baseline here. But you can see that this was from McAfee's threat report, not because I have a particular affinity for them, but I do think they have a good threat report. That's why I chose that as a source. But you can see it's over 50 million samples in Q2 of 2017. And those are new samples. Those are new, unique samples. Those are not duplicates. So the real numbers of what these companies are dealing with and what you as defenders are dealing with are actually much, much higher than that. Ransomware, again, off from its peak in 2016, but still on an upward trajectory. And so, these are all things that we deal with as defenders. And again, I think that as an industry, we have this tendency to kind of look for silver bullets and shiny objects to help us deal with this ever-rising flood of attacks and exploits. And in reality, if we look at a couple of case studies, as we're going to do, we'll see that actually taking a security, hygiene-focused approach actually pays a higher dividend for that. One of the things that's sort of endemic of this this hype that's in the industry this shiny object syndrome, if you want to call it that, is almost this celebrity status that vulnerabilities have attained. And this is very, very different from how things were when I started in this field. Vulnerabilities used to be these really dry academic white paper type, releases that, to be perfectly honest, very few people really truly understood. They may understand the impact, they may understand how to fix it, but to truly understand the vulnerability, it was actually a very small circle of people, at least in my experience. But starting with Ghost and then followed up with Heartbleed, Shell Shock, there's a whole long list of them. Again, these vulnerabilities almost became like celebrities. They have their own logo. You expect that some of these vulnerability authors or some of the people who write the papers for this, maybe they're submitting, business plans and getting VC investment for their vulnerability. It's kind of crazy. And even since this slide was created, there's actually now Bad Rabbit and the duck attack. So it's like this constant thing. And again, it's this sort of that shiny object syndrome, if you will, of focusing on this really interesting hype around this. But these are real vulnerabilities. These are real things that can cause real harm. And I think that having that focus potentially on the flashiness of it or the press around it kind of loses some focus on that. If we look at, in this particular case, we're going to talk in detail about the shadow brokers release and the impact that had on society, right? In the form of WannaCry. So WannaCry, I'm sure a lot of people in this room, the gentleman that was just speaking here before we came up, was talking about ransomware, and that was an offshoot of this particular malware. And this used that Eternal Blue exploit as a part of the shadow brokers release as its propagation method. It was followed up very quickly by Petya, and then NotPetya or Netya. I've heard it called a couple of different names. And again, I'm sure that even if you didn't deal with this in your organization, you're familiar with the headlines and the issues that were surrounding, the problems that were surrounding this particular suite of ransomware. And what's really frustrating from a defender standpoint is the fact that if we look at the timeline, much of the impact of this really didn't need to happen. All right, much of the impact of this really did not need to happen the way that it did. If we look at the timeline, we look at how this unfolded. Microsoft had advanced notice of the shadow brokers tools that were going to be dropped. They actually worked to release patches preemptively for that, and they did release those patches in March of 2017, on March 14th of 2017. And there's two patches in particular as it pertains to this talk, but MS-17 010 is the big granddaddy of this particular one. But the fix was out there. The fix was available, and it was freely available to anybody. And about a month later, in fact, exactly a month later, the shadow brokers tools were dumped, and it contained detailed exploit code for anybody who wanted to exploit these particular exploits, right? There were, I'm sure, probably people in this room, you have some of those PDFs that were circulating around exactly how to use Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar to take over a system. I mean, it was a piece of cake. It was something that a 10-year-old could do. And so it was not very difficult necessarily to leverage these particular vulnerabilities. WannaCry hit about a month after the shadow brokers tools released. And it leveraged that Eternal Blue SMB exploit as its primary propagation method. Petya followed about a month after that, a little more than a month after that, and then immediately after that was Netya, right, or NotPetya. But for those shops that actually had a robust security hygiene program, these were largely non-events. For those shops that did not have that security hygiene approach, these things were devastating. I read reports where there were organizations with 10, 15, 20,000 endpoints that were compromised by this in a matter of minutes, And just think of how crippling that is to the enterprise, to your ability not just to keep systems up and running, but to actually function as a business. I mean, I have another slide that talks about the societal impact, but it's immense. And all of this was potentially avoidable. All of this was, the fix for this was out there. And yet this was this crippling attack, this crippling wave of attacks that hit. In preparing for this particular talk, I did a quick Shodan search, and it's maybe a little bit difficult to see there what the search criteria was, but I looked for any Windows systems that had port 445 open and that had a banner of SMB1. And this is as of about 10 days ago, and it was over 1 million hits. Now, is it possible that some of those systems have, the patches applied to it and they just haven't disabled SMB1? Yes, it's possible. But I would be willing to bet a sizable sum of money that at least half of those systems are probably vulnerable to this. And they're still out there. So it's just waiting for that next wave of these attacks to hit. If we look at, again, at the societal impact of the release of those tools and what that wave of ransomware has done, I mean, it's affected every facet of our lives. You look at hospitals, police stations, transportation systems. I mean, that's real impact in the kinetic world. This is not just some theoretical thing. This is not, just something that's going to cause some temporary harm to a small number of individuals. This potentially affects society. And again, the conditions are ripe for this to happen again. If we look at another real-world, scenario, the Apache Struts vulnerability. So it was released and announced at about the same time that the patches were released by Microsoft. It was in March of 2017. There was a patch that was released at the time that this was announced, and within days there was exploit code that was available for Metasploit. So anybody who had Metasploit could exploit this and do so remotely and with devastating consequences. Equifax was breached between May and July. They haven't released an actual date. So between 2 and 4 months after this patch was available, they were breached by this particular vulnerability. And by the way, I only mention them because they're in the press, and this is in no way, shape, or form an attempt to in any way denigrate them, their company, or their efforts. I think that they probably are endemic of a lot of shops that are out there, probably far too many shops that are out there, to be perfectly honest. So I don't think they're an outlier. But, they're a great case study, and that's the only reason that I use them, because they were in the press. You can see that there was a follow-up release of another vulnerability in September, also followed up with a patch, and then immediately after that, the breach was publicly announced. If we look at the actual vulnerability details itself, and this may be difficult to see, I apologize for that, but this is the CVE 2017-5638. This was the original vulnerability. I mean, this is like the Sigourney Weaver alien of vulnerabilities. This thing is close to a perfect vulnerability as you're ever going to see. It certainly is as much as I've ever seen. CVSS score of 10. Confidentiality impact complete. There is a total information disclosure. It's written right there in the report. Integrity impact, complete. There is a total compromise of system integrity. Availability impact, complete. Access complexity, very little knowledge or skill is required to exploit. Authentication, not required. I mean, this is like the granddaddy super vulnerability, right? And yet, for months, at least one high-profile shop that we know of, and I'm sure many others, failed to patch this vulnerability. And it led to the biggest data breach that we know of, at least right now. I think that it's a safe bet that there will be other data breaches that follow that will probably eclipse this, right? But at least right now, it's the largest one to date. And it was all completely avoidable. It was all completely avoidable. With the right focus in the right areas, this was avoidable. If we look at the impact, again, almost half of the population in the United States was affected. I was affected. I'm sure Dan was affected. Probably a good portion of the people in this room were affected. The final numbers for this particular breach, based on this vulnerability, I don't know that it'll ever be known. And the long-term impact has yet to play itself out. So we don't know what that's going to look like. The cost, the direct cost to that one business were estimated somewhere between $300 and $325 million. So, when you look at those costs and you think about how little it would have cost to have a robust program focused on security hygiene in place to avoid this, I mean, you literally pennies on the dollar, fractions of pennies on the dollar. Loss of brand reputation. If you look at their stock ticker, it looks like it fell off a cliff, right? And now they have recovered some. To their credit, I think that they are trying to respond as best as they can. And I do think that there's a lesson there from this as well as some other high-profile breaches that have occurred, that really the recovery in how a company handles that, how an organization handles that, because it isn't always a private company, how an organization handles that really is going to be the tail of the tape of how or if they recover from it. And I actually think that they're doing some good things here. But the impact of this is devastating, and it was completely avoidable. So with the backdrop of that, again, we as defenders, we talk to a lot of vendors. We work for a vendor, okay? So full disclosure, right? I got all these from actual security vendors' websites. These are screenshots. I purposely left their logos out because I'm not here to vendor shame. I just really want to kind of point out that, again, this is sort of that shiny object-ish syndrome that we seem to suffer from in info security. Unmatched protection against malware-based attacks. The end-to-end security operations platform. Best detection and accuracy ever in protecting against advanced persistent threats. So there's a lot of these lofty claims that are being made by a lot of vendors. And honestly, I think that in many cases, they actually do have some really good products. But if you're looking at it just from a standpoint that we need a silver bullet, the silver bullet's not going to work, all right? So if only we had the Screaming Goat APT detection system in our system, in our network, well, it's just going to knock out that malware like Batman and Robin, right? Biff, pow, socko. And the reality is that's just not reality, all right? There is a time and a place for some of these. That's really distracting, so I'm going to move on. There is a time and a place for some of these products, but it has to be part of an overall, again, hygiene-focused approach. And this shiny object syndrome, Dan and I are referring to this as the Kardashian Effect. All right, the Kardashian Effect that's been applied to info security. And if you look on Urban Dictionary, the Kardashian Effect is when someone or something becomes famous despite or because of a lack of skill, talent, or ability, right? And I think that you can apply that to what we see in some of the hype in the Infosec security world, where there's a lot of, again, there's a lot of claims being tossed around, I think largely by a lot of people who don't truly understand the problem. And what we really need, in our opinion, what we really need, and I think is something that a lot of organizations are starting to put their arms around, is more of a return to basics. So for that, we actually like Malcolm Gladwell in terms of more of a role model for our industry, more of something to aspire to. So if you know anything about Malcolm Gladwell, he wrote a book called Outliers, and in it he talks about how it takes hard work, right? It takes hard work to get things accomplished. You're not going to become an expert overnight. In his theory, it takes 10,000 hours to be good at something. It's 20 hours a week for 10 years. And that's not to say that if you start today, it's going to take 10 years to clean up the mess that you probably inherited wherever it is that you work. That's just a completely depressing thought. But the idea here is that, we really need to get away from this silver bullet, this shiny object mentality, and get back to the hard work of actually performing the basics. If you have the basics down and you're very robust in those basics, then by all means, if there's a capability to add on to that with a silver bullet, or something that claims to be a silver bullet, then you know what, that might actually be a good approach. But from a standpoint of being able to return value to the business, being able to actually that bang for the buck, you're going to get way more of it from a security hygiene approach. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to my colleague, Dan.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you guys today. I was a little disappointed when we put this together. So Jim got to talk about Kim Kardashian, all these fancy breaches, and I get the too long, slow, dull, tiresome, monotonous, and hopefully it's not a very tedious journey here. But what I do want to talk about is what Jim had mentioned, kind of this back to the basics approach. So how do we build a security hygiene capability within our organization and make sure we're addressing patching, we're addressing vulnerabilities, we're building things in a way that potentially we won't have the same breaches or opportunities for breaches in our organizations. Typically when we're doing that, when we're building out a security capability in an organization, we typically look to frameworks. And there's a lot of them out there that you could leverage. So this is the Nist Cybersecurity framework, COBIT. I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with these. The CIS controls, as well as just a whole host of a myriad of products and solutions, and vendors beating down your door. Government or compliance requirements. Maybe that's PCI. Maybe that's HIPAA. And all this could really be overwhelming if you're sitting in that seat and you're responsible for, kind of pushing forward a security capability within an organization. And I think, I think that this was coined in the past by CIS as the fog of more, right? So we just have all this overwhelming information that's available to us, and it could be difficult to understand what are we going to prioritize. What should we really focus on first? What is really going to make it harder and more difficult for an attacker to be successful in our environment, right? And that really should be our focus as we build out our capabilities. And what we're going to talk about today is and I'm sure many of you may be familiar with them, are the CIS controls. So just to give you guys a little bit of background on these, they originally were called the SANS top 20 critical controls. These originated within the NSA back in 2008. And they were built as a way to help the DoD prioritize their security controls. They were based on some of the methods that the NSA had found to be the most effective for preventing some of the attacks that they were doing as a red team against both government and critical infrastructure. And they found that these basic controls really could potentially prevent a lot of the things that they were trying to do. You can see that there's a number 1 to 20. I know it may be a little bit hard to see. But really what I want to point out here is these are our prioritized group of controls. So really you should start on number 1, the inventory authorized and unauthorized devices, right? That's going to be a foundational control that a lot of others are going to be built on, and you could start working your way down. You can see I have the first 5 that are bolded here. These are the ones that we're going to focus on in a little more detail today. I definitely encourage you to go out to the CIS website. We have it a link on the bottom there. If you guys want to dive in a little bit deeper and understand the controls in a little more detail than we're going to be able to talk about today. But these first 5 controls are considered the foundational cyber hygiene controls. And Jim had mentioned cyber hygiene. It has been proven that if you implement these controls well, you could potentially prevent 80% of some of the breaches that we've seen. And Jim had mentioned a couple of them. So if we're doing a good job of patching, we've identified all the devices on our network. Where we have the ability to look at our software and know which software we have deployed and what versions. You could actually boil these down into some pretty simple questions to make it even a little simpler. So basic questions like, do we know what's connected to our systems and our networks? A lot of times, from a Tanium perspective, we'll go into an organization, we'll ask them, how many endpoints do you have? A lot of times we get a range. I have between 15 and 18,000 machines, or I have between 45 and 50,000 machines. A lot of times folks just aren't sure, how many machines you have in your environment. We really need to be able to go out, find those, be able to inventory those, and know exactly what's on your network, because we can't defend what we don't know about. Do we know what software's running? Do you have the ability to get a full software inventory within your organization? With version, and how quickly can you do that, right? Is that a huge effort? Is that going to take 2 months to be able to compile that data, or can you do that quickly? Are we continuously managing our systems using known good configurations? As we know, out of the box, a lot of systems and software aren't configured in a secure way, right? And there's some work that we need to do to identify, what's the right way to configure something. Let's reduce some of these vulnerabilities that we have, just based on a system coming out of the box. And are we applying that to all our systems? And that kind of speaks back to, the way that we've prioritized things. Again, if we're pushing out these configurations, if we don't even know about the devices, we're going to have no chance of doing that, right? So we've really got to focus top down as we work through these controls. Are we continuously working for and managing bad known software? So this is really about vulnerability management and patching. Are we identifying vulnerabilities? Then are we actually solving them? Or do we just have a huge pile and a huge report coming out of our vulnerability management system and we're not doing anything about them, right? And do we limit and track the people that have admin privileges? So this is a big one. You think about your domain admin accounts that are essentially, God in your MS AD environment. Are we limiting those accounts? Are we keeping a good audit of how many accounts we have there? Are we tracking if new accounts are added? Are we sending alerts to our security team? And do we have a handle on those? So to dive in a little bit deeper on each one of the controls, let's start with CIS Critical Control 1. And really this is around a few things. You got to start with some kind of discovery process. It's really recommended. There's a couple of different approaches you could take. One being an active method, so that you just think of Nmap we have on the screen here. There's a lot of tools that obviously that could do this, but that's actually going out, taking a list of IP addresses, scanning, identifying them, interrogating them, understanding what's the host name of the system, what ports may be open on it, what operating system is it running, and then you could also include some passive techniques as well, and that's just taking some of the systems that we have that are supporting our network today and taking what data they have about our endpoints and using that as well to try to identify things. So, it could be, just your switches themselves. Their ARP tables have a lot of good information about what's connecting to your network. You could take your firewall logs, IDS. Some IDS systems will actually help you do this as well and kind of build out an asset inventory just based on looking at the network traffic that's going through. And all this could also be sent over to a SIM solution. Another good source of information is Dhcp server logging. As a system comes online, obviously it's going to, if it's configured for DHCP, it's going to ask for an IP address. But it also sends information about itself that identifies it, things like the host name and MAC address that you could use to build out your discovery capability. And then one thing to keep in mind as we go through the controls that's very important is you got to think about how I could automate this. It's one thing if I do a lot of manual effort, I collect all this data, but how do I make this repeatable? So I could constantly keep this data up to date. I could constantly keep it fresh. And there's certainly a lot of commercial tools that could help you in that capacity. So once we have this data, really the next step is to build out our asset inventory. So you may leverage a CMDB solution that you already have in your organization. Figure out how to get that data that you've used in your discovery, and how do you get that into that asset inventory? Make sure that's up to date and fresh. Again, automation is key here. So, and once we have that, so now we have this asset inventory, it's up to date, it's fresh. Now we could start to consider maybe adding some additional controls, things like network authentication. You could consider 802.1x. There's a lot of NAC solutions you could leverage. We really recommend certificate-based authentication, so you're identifying not only the user but also the device. And that's a way to start to reduce those machines that you don't want on your network. Maybe it's a shadow IT problem. Maybe it's somebody bringing in their Wi-Fi router and plugging into your network, and we're going to reduce the opportunities for those to cause problems. So once we have a good handle on our assets and we have that accurate asset inventory, really the next step is to consider Control 2, which is really looking at the software running on our endpoints. Do we have an inventory of software as well? And really it's very similar to Control 1. So do we have the ability to quickly take information from our endpoints, determine what software is running, and then also take that and then tie it into that inventory that we've already built. So now you have a one-stop shop you could go to where I could look up an asset, understand exactly what software is on it, and maybe that's useful if you're doing an engagement from an incident response standpoint. Maybe you want to know what's on that system. To have that accurate and up-to-date can be very helpful. You can leverage tools that you already have in your environment. A lot of folks are running SCCM from a management standpoint. So you need to figure out a way, how do you mine that data make sure it's up to date and accurate, and get that into your inventory. Again, automation, makes a lot of sense here. And then once you have that, so now I have this list of all my applications, it's really about then from an organizational standpoint understanding which ones are actually authorized, which applications are really important to our business, and which ones, are going to cause risk or we just don't even need. All right, so it's really about building out that list of your authorized applications to really move into potentially thinking about doing something like application whitelisting, which is really something that's going to make your pen testers, your attackers on your network have a bad day, right? It's going to make things a lot harder. It's not perfect. There's ways to get around it, but it's going to make things very difficult if you are able to implement this. I really, suggest a phased approach. We see a lot of folks maybe start with blacklisting. Now we have this list of authorized applications. We know, what shouldn't be authorized on our network. Maybe we start just blacklisting some of the applications that we don't want. But the goal is to eventually get to a full whitelisting policy. You can leverage tools, again, that you already own. AppLocker on most enterprise versions of the Windows clients is available. So certainly that's something you could use to build out a whitelisting policy. And I will point to this Nist guideline. They have a really good write-up on how to implement whitelisting in your network. It's very detailed, and I definitely recommend checking that out. So we talked about earlier, the out-of-the-box configurations may not be strong. You may have devices with admin login credentials. We've all seen those in the past. So how do we take care of that? And there's plenty of benchmarks out that you could leverage to understand what is a secured configuration for a device, right? And that could be the CIS benchmarks are a great place to start. They actually package tools that you could leverage as well. Syscat Lite is a free tool you could download. They have commercial tools if you do join the CIS group that you could leverage as well. If you're in the federal space, STIGs is probably something that you're very well aware of. But the idea is to take these, customize it to my environment, figure out what makes sense for my company, and enforce these on our endpoints, right? And there's lots of ways you could do that. Group policy on the Unix or Linux side, you could consider Puppet, and then MDM solutions for your mobile devices. And then once you have those out there, and maybe I've built secure images, I'm pretty confident. I've hardened my systems in a way that makes sense for my organization. You got to make sure you have the ability to scan if changes occur, right? So we call that deviations from those standards. We have to have that ability to go out and check and make sure that those configurations that we decided on are still there, right? That an administrator hasn't changed those and reversed them to make his life easier. We got to make sure we keep an eye on that and make sure that we're checking those, and maybe even send alerts if we see deviations back to our admins to take care of. So if you do those things, now you have a pretty mature capability here from a secure configuration standpoint. You can start to consider using file integrity monitoring tools. Just look for critical system files maybe that are being monitored outside of a normal change window. So again, another way that you could potentially see if somebody's doing what they shouldn't be on their endpoints. So moving on to Control 4. Again, this is about both vulnerability management and patching. Again, you need the ability to just do vulnerability scanning on your endpoints in general, but you really need to focus on all systems. A lot of times we focus on we're just going to scan our servers. We don't have time for our endpoints. It's just too many of them. They're moving around too much. But we really got to get to the place where we could scan all of our systems, right? We have this asset inventory. We've done a lot of work to build that up. We need to make sure we have a complete picture when we do our vulnerability scanning. And again, the frequency recommended here by CS could be a real challenge as well. Are you doing that on a weekly basis or more frequent? A lot of organizations, maybe get through maybe a quarterly scan just based on some of the network constraints that you have. So there's a couple pointers you could look at as, agent-based scanning could help. It doesn't solve all of your problems, but when you consider your endpoints as a whole, your laptops, your desktops, you're going to be able to get data a lot faster, and you're not going to put as much of a strain on your network to get it back. Once you have this information, you want to start prioritizing by risk rating. So Jim had the struts vulnerability up there. That was a CVSS10. That's something that should be a high priority. for your organization that you go out and make sure that that's patched so you don't end up in a situation where you get breached. And then you could start with open source tools. There's plenty of them available. But again, commercial tools are going to help you from an automation standpoint. You want to make this a repeatable process that you're continually doing. Once you've done that, the next logical step is you need to actually patch things. So I've seen a lot of times you have this huge report, with all these vulnerabilities, but then it gets difficult, right? So you need to work with your ops teams, make sure you're on the same page, that you're actually patching those systems, not only the operating systems but the applications themselves, which could be challenging. One of the other issues we see regularly is your patching software even working right? So maybe you're using SCCM. Is WMI corrupt on some of your systems? Are those patches actually getting out there? You need a way to validate and make sure that software is actually working. Otherwise, it's not doing you any good. And then for those systems, we always have systems on our network that can't be patched for whatever reason, right? So those we want to consider maybe doing some kind of network segmentation, put them off to the side, make sure they aren't a risk to the organization. And lastly, Control 5. This is really about controlled use of administrative privileges. So really think about your highly privileged accounts. So the most common ones we see are domain admin accounts, your enterprise admin accounts, and make sure that you're auditing those groups regularly, that really only the people that really need that privilege have it. And then you want to make sure if anyone's being added to that particular group that maybe you know about it. You send that to a list of security folks or administrators within your organization, so everyone knows when there's any modifications to that particular group. And then you want to protect your accounts, right? So Microsoft has some really great guidance. If you look at their Pass the Hash white papers, I have a link to it down there. They have 2 versions of it. Really gives you great information on how to better structure your Active Directory environment to prevent credential theft. So some of the highlights from that, you want to consider maybe using dedicated administrative workstations. So anytime you log in with your domain admin account on a particular system, you do an interactive login, you're essentially storing a hash on that system. And that's something that could be stolen by an attacker and then used to infiltrate other systems, move laterally, and eventually get to your domain controllers, which a lot of times is the goal. Consider using a password vault. So that would allow you to take those accounts, store them in a vault, and maybe you change those every day or you change those every week, and you add a multi-factor authentication on top of that. Again, making it more difficult for an attacker to get to those accounts. That's going to give them access to everything in your network, the keys to the kingdom. And then consider using log passwords as well. Okay, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jim, and he's going to talk about how we talk to the business.
Thanks, Dan. So we've kind of laid out where some of the problems are. What we feel is a common sense approach to addressing many of those problems and those shortcomings. So, the obvious next question is, how do we get the support that we need from the stakeholders and the decision makers in the business to be able to actually implement something like this? I think that there's probably a lot of accounts and organizations that are out there that they know that they're deficient, but they need to get the people who control the checkbook to actually write a check. Or in some cases, maybe it isn't writing a check. The investment could be in priority. It could be in manpower, right? It could be that I don't have to do 15 other things for my job. I can focus on this. And so how do we talk to the business about making that business justification? And the important thing is we can't talk to the business the way we as techies talk to each other. That's going to bounce off. That's not something that they understand. It's not something that they absorb. When you talk to the business and the stakeholders, what they understand is money, basically. All right? So everything really kind of ties back to a dollar amount. And so there's a lot of good tools that are out there. In researching this particular talk, we found this particular study. The link is at the bottom there. And by the way, I should mention, anybody who wants these slides at the end will be available if you want to stop by the booth and get a business card and just shoot us an email. We'll be happy to send you the slides. But down at the bottom there is there's a Ponemon breach calculator. And I really like this. This is actually very current. This came out this year. The reason I like this is that you can plug in your industry segment, your geography, and there's a long list of other different criteria as it pertains to, your business, your processes, the different risk mitigation factors that you have in place or additional risk factors that you have in place or that you're facing. And then it spits out a number. And it gives you a number that's defendable, that's a real number that you can use with the business stakeholders to be able to go to them and essentially give them a price tag for doing nothing. Here's a price tag for doing nothing. We know that we have a problem. We have to make some investments, whether that be in manpower, whether that be purchasing some type of external tool, whether that be hiring additional people, whatever it is, whatever we see as being the way to address this. Here's the cost of doing nothing. And I think this is a very powerful message. And it's a message that resonates with the business, right? And remembering that security is not the elimination of risk, it is the acceptance of risk. And there are acceptable risks. I drove here last night. The highway is one of the deadliest places in America. But I took the risk of getting in my car and driving up here because the payoff is worth it, right? We all do that all the time. We accept risk all the time. And sometimes this is an exercise in just explaining to the business, how much risk are you willing to accept? And they may actually look at you and say, we're willing to accept that. At a minimum, at that point, then should that crucial breach occur, you've done your due diligence as a defender to explaining to the business that, this is what you can expect should that occur. The other thing that the business needs when you're talking to the business is metrics, right? So it's not enough to tell them we've got this huge problem and I need a lot of money or I need 5 more people on the team. We have to actually give them metrics of where the problem is. And the other great thing about metrics is that once you've assembled them, it gives you a baseline to then show progress. Should we get the stakeholders to invest in this process and in this program, then we can now show progress towards the goal. And so we can actually hold our own feet to the fire and in some cases, toot our own horn and show, just kind of prove to the business what a good job as defenders we're doing, what their investment bought them. So, so these are not by any means meant to be a complete list of questions. But again, as Dan had mentioned, how many unauthorized devices are on your network? How long does it take to detect those new devices, if you can detect them at all? What percentage of the business systems are missing critical patches? How long does it take for that to occur? And then being able to potentially trend that over time and provide that, defendable, hard data to the stakeholders as evidence of, this is your return on investment. And the other thing that we found that is very, very useful in talking to the business and getting buy-in from the stakeholders is being able to show, particularly if it's an outside entity, being able to quantify just the extent of the problem. And that's where certain professional services can come into play. Now, Tanium does not sell professional services. I told you this isn't a sales pitch, and it's not. So we don't actually sell any professional services, so I'm not pitching any here. I can just tell you from my own experience in working with numerous shops over the years that this can be a very valuable tool for being able to build consensus within the business community of the organization. To be able to go to them and say, we've got this report. So remember I told you that it might be over $8 million if we get hit with a breach? Well, here's a report that's showing you exactly how easy that is for it to occur and the steps that they took to do it. Right? And if you can't get the business to invest in those, one thing from my own experience that I've found, if there's a turnover in management, that tends to be a good time to be able to request these sorts of things because that new manager is going to want to know what it is that he or she is facing in terms of what they're going to have to work with. And this then gives them the tools that they need to go to the board or whoever to get the budget that they feel that they need. But even in situations where that's not possible, there are a lot of free tools and resources that are out there. The one that you see there on GitHub, this awesome-pen test, I really love that particular repository because it's got a lot of really good capabilities and resources in one place. There's a lot of links. There's a lot of different links to different tools, different frameworks, different capabilities. The one there in particular, the penetration testing framework, I really is awesome if, particularly if it's something that you've never done before and you're new at. It actually has this very voluminous list. It's an HTML document that lists out in detail all the different steps involved in performing a pen test, all the different tools that you would use. It even goes so far as to actually include the command line options. So if you've never used that tool before, it actually will tell you how to. So, these resources are out there. So if you can't get the buy-in from the business, everybody sitting in here, I assume, has a laptop. And so with a simple Google search and a couple of tools that you can download, you actually could be able to compile that report on your own. And the important thing, again, when talking to the business, beyond just talking in things that they understand, dollars and cents usually, is to have a plan, right? It's not enough to go to them and say, our processes suck, we're completely open to the next breach, and it's going to kill the company if that happens. They don't want to hear that. What they want to hear is, I've got a plan to address it. And here's the cost of risk. We talked about using that calculator, the cost of doing nothing. And here's the cost of what it is that I'm asking for. Whether it be, again, hiring new personnel, maybe investing in other technologies or processes that are lacking. And then the metrics for success. And when you can approach the stakeholders with this type of an ROI, giving them what the costs involved are, how we're going to measure success, and what our potential payoff is, then this is the sort of business justification that gets very, very difficult for people at the boardroom to deny it, particularly when they see the type of high-profile breaches that are happening on a pretty much daily basis. Because let's face it, it's their neck that's in the noose for the most part, not ours. It's generally not the technical people that get 86'd in those situations, but the executive level people are keenly aware of the fact that if something like this hits, that they're going to have to answer for it. So if you are then the person coming to them with a solution, you're the hero. And that's exactly what hopefully everybody here has gotten some idea of, some ways and to go about that. So that's pretty much what we had. Does anybody have any questions or anything that you guys would like to delve into? I know. Yes, sir. Yeah. That's a tough situation. So for anybody who didn't hear the question, it was about balancing the immediate needs and the fires that are burning right now, if I could paraphrase what's happening right now, versus a long term. And I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. The only answer that I could say there is that, again, if you, during those moments when the fire is not burning hot, which hopefully there are some, start to build some of this foundational work so that, you can get that buy-in, so that hopefully you can get some assistance to help when the fires are burning. But I do completely understand, I feel like a ping pong ball some days, so. Well, I know we're standing between you guys and lunch, so thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it, and enjoy the con.